The cameras were still flashing when Donald Trump declared the biggest deal ever with Japan. A headline number of $550 billion, lower tariffs on Japanese goods, and a promise that U.S. industries from LNG to semiconductors would be flooded with allied capital. Weeks later, the same spotlight turned harsh. Tokyo abruptly pulled back, and a new prime minister, Sanae Takayachi, signaled on national television that Japan would not wire a dollar without control over where it goes. Markets jolted, the yen wobbled, and a question echoed from Washington to Tokyo. Did America just overplay its hand in Asia? This story isn't about a failed photo op. It's about sovereignty colliding with coercive economics and a region that no longer moves on Washington's timeline. Inside Tokyo's Ministry of Finance, officials warned that outsourcing investment decisions to a U.S. accelerator with a 45-day consultation window and no voting rights threatened Japan's fiscal stability, already burdened by debt above 260% of GDP. Inside Nagatacho, the political price was worse. The previous leader's embrace of the framework looked less like statecraft and more like capitulation. When Takayachi took office, she turned one sentence into policy. Japan will not fund projects it cannot govern. The shock rippled fast. South Korea questioned a parallel $350 billion framework. U.S. defense and energy contractors sold off. Analysts in London and Singapore asked whether this was a one-off rupture, or the moment Asia quietly turned away from American pressure. And for U.S. viewers, the stakes are immediate. If allies stop wiring giant checks to anchor U.S. reindustrialization, who pays for the promised jobs in shipbuilding, chips, and energy terminals? If tariffs and threats now push partners to delay, reroute, or defy, what does that mean for prices, supply chains, and the next decade of American manufacturing? The headline says, Japan rejects Trump's biggest deal. The deeper truth is sharper. Asia is asserting terms, not taking them. And when allies start saying no, it's not just a diplomatic embarrassment, it's a structural warning about how the U.S. wields economic power in a multipolar world. What failed first? The math, the politics, or the assumption that allies won't push back? To understand how Trump's $550 billion biggest deal ever collapsed so spectacularly, we need to rewind to the story behind the handshake and the illusion that America's allies would simply keep saying yes. It began in July 2025, when the White House lawn became the stage for what Trump called a new era of alliance capitalism. Standing beside executives from General Electric, ExxonMobil, and Lockheed Martin, he boasted that Japan had agreed to invest $500 billion into U.S. industries, money that would revive American shipyards, fund semiconductor plants, and make America richer than ever before. The crowd applauded. The cameras rolled. But behind the optics, Tokyo's negotiators were uneasy. The so-called framework wasn't a legally binding treaty, it was a political understanding, full of vague language and one-sided control mechanisms. Under the U.S. terms, every dollar of Japanese investment would be managed through a newly created federal office, the U.S. Investment Accelerator, with Washington deciding where and how the funds were spent. Tokyo would have a 45-day consultation window, no voting rights, and no final authority. For Trump, this structure was proof that America had regained leverage. For Japan, it looked like a blank check, a financial subordination dressed up as partnership. A fragile alliance turned transactional. This wasn't the first time friction had surfaced between Washington and Tokyo. In 2020's 2023, when Trump reimposed 25% auto tariffs on Japanese cars, Tokyo reluctantly complied with reciprocal measures, a symbolic show of defiance in a relationship long defined by restraint. By the time Trump returned to office in 2025, Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, had fractured. Former Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba was already under fire for conceding too much to Washington's trade demands. Facing a rebellion within his own party, he signed the framework out of fear, not conviction, hoping the U.S. would ease tariffs in return. But Japan's public wasn't fooled. The Financial Times reported his approval ratings plummeted below 20%, with critics accusing him of outsourcing Japan's fiscal independence. His resignation was inevitable, and so was the backlash. Enter Sanae Takayachi, Japan's first female prime minister. When Sanae Takayachi rose to power in October 2025, she brought a new doctrine: partnership through equality. A protege of Shinzo Abe, she was hawkish on defense, skeptical of Beijing, but fiercely committed to Japan's sovereignty. Her first act as prime minister wasn't to meet with Washington. It was to review every clause of the Trump framework. Within days, she found what Tokyo's bureaucrats had warned about. The deal allowed the U.S. Treasury to allocate Japanese capital without Japanese consent. In her first televised address, she spoke carefully but firmly. Any arrangement that undermines our national interest will be reconsidered. Japan will contribute to global stability, but never at the cost of its independence. Those 29 words detonated across diplomatic circles. The next morning, the yen strengthened. Japanese bond yields fell, and international investors interpreted her stance as a signal of domestic control over foreign policy. Why the numbers never added up. Even on its own terms, the deal was structurally unsound. Japan's national debt was already hovering at 260% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. Its fiscal agencies warned that wiring hundreds of billions abroad could destabilize bond markets and weaken domestic investment. Bloomberg later revealed that Tokyo's finance ministry had secretly drafted a report describing the framework as fiscally hazardous and legally unenforceable. In private, bureaucrats nicknamed it the deal of surrender. But when Trump publicly announced that America will pocket 90% of the profits, the political humiliation in Tokyo was complete. What was meant to be proof of partnership now looked like proof of subservience. The breaking point. By October 1st, Japan's chief negotiator, Ryo Akazawa, stepped before cameras and declared that Tokyo would retain control of all project selection through the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC. Translation: Japan would manage its own money on its own terms. For the U.S., that statement was an open challenge. For the markets, it was a reality check. For Asia, it was a turning point. Because Takayachi's rejection wasn't just about one agreement, it was about redefining the entire post-war hierarchy. The unspoken rule that Washington sets the terms and Tokyo complies. That rule had just been broken. The reverberations from Tokyo's defiance didn't stop at the Sea of Japan. They echoed across every major capital in Asia, shaking the foundations of what Washington once called the Indo-Pacific Alliance. In just a matter of days, markets, governments, and global institutions realized this wasn't a diplomatic misunderstanding. It was a strategic rebellion against America's economic coercion. Tokyo's ripple effect, a message to the world. When Prime Minister Sanae Takayachi tore up the deal on live television, she wasn't simply rejecting a U.S. trade framework. She was broadcasting a doctrine. Her words, calm, deliberate, and unwavering, carried across Asia's financial screens. Japan's cooperation cannot be dictated. Partnership must mean parity. Within hours, the Nikkei rebounded, the yen stabilized, and domestic approval for Takayachi surged past 60%. What looked like defiance was, in reality, restored confidence, the sense that Japan had reasserted its identity after decades of playing second to Washington's strategy. Across Tokyo's corporate boardrooms, the reaction was electric. CEOs who once complained quietly about American overreach began speaking openly about building a self-determined trade network, one that could link Tokyo, Seoul, Taipei, and even New Delhi, without waiting for U.S. approval. Seoul's soft rebellion. Just 48 hours later, South Korea quietly followed Japan's lead. Under its own $350 billion framework with Washington, Seoul had been expected to transfer large sums up front for joint development projects. But after Tokyo's announcement, South Korea's national security advisor told Reuters, "We cannot pay $350 billion in cash, no government would." The statement was polite, but its meaning was unmistakable. Asia was done writing checks to America's ambitions. Instead, Seoul proposed a regional investment fund managed jointly by Asian economies, a direct challenge to the US-centric financial structure that had dominated since the Cold War. This was no longer about tariffs or trade balances. It was about control of capital, who decides where Asia's money flows and under whose terms. Markets catch the message. On Wall Street, traders saw what politicians refused to admit. Washington's leverage over Asia was weakening. Shares of U.S. defense and energy contractors fell by 6% overnight. The Dow Jones dipped as analysts warned the Trump doctrine might backfire. Meanwhile, the Tokyo Stock Exchange rallied on the perception that Japan had regained financial sovereignty. Bloomberg called it a textbook case of soft power inversion. In other words, America flexed, Asia adapted, and the market rewarded independence. Asia's new economic language. Behind closed doors in Singapore, Bangkok, and Jakarta, finance ministers began discussing something unprecedented: a post-dollar alliance for Asian infrastructure investment. The idea wasn't radical, it was pragmatic. If the US demanded control and Beijing demanded loyalty, why not build an alternative that required neither? For countries caught between two economic giants, Japan's defiance was liberating. It proved that a US ally could resist without being punished, and that the American tariff playbook no longer guaranteed obedience. Europe and the Middle East react. Across Brussels and Berlin, diplomats called Japan's move the most significant Allied pushback in a generation. The European Union, long frustrated by Washington's unilateral sanctions and trade pressures, quietly praised Tokyo for restoring balance in trans-Pacific relations. Even in the Middle East, where energy deals often hinge on U.S. approval, Japan's defiance was seen as a signal that the West's internal unity was fracturing. Saudi analysts noted that Washington's influence is no longer an automatic default. The China factor. Quiet satisfaction. In Beijing, officials didn't celebrate openly. They didn't have to. State media called Japan's decision a reflection of sovereignty, carefully avoiding gloating language, but the symbolism was clear. For years, China had been accused of buying influence through debt-trap diplomacy. Now, the United States was being accused of trying to rent it. By doing nothing, Beijing won. It didn't need to pressure allies. Washington's own demands did that for them. China's foreign ministry even offered an olive branch. Asia's prosperity depends on equality, not subordination. It was the kind of soft, careful phrasing that wins hearts, not headlines. And across Asia, it worked. The emerging divide. From Tokyo to Seoul to Singapore, a quiet consensus was forming. Not anti-American, but post-American. The world's most advanced economies were no longer looking to Washington for permission. They were looking to one another for partnership. In less than 3 months, the America First trade doctrine had accomplished the opposite of its intention. It had accelerated Asia's independence, and in doing so, it triggered what some economists now call the reversal of the Pacific Order. Because when allies start saying no, not out of rebellion, but out of reason, it's no longer about loyalty. It's about leverage, and for the first time in decades, the leverage had shifted east. For Washington, the collapse of Trump's biggest deal ever was more than a diplomatic failure. It was a strategic shockwave that cut deep into the foundations of America's post-war influence. The White House had expected a victory lap. Instead, it faced a rebellion from the very allies that once formed the backbone of its Indo-Pacific strategy. The shock in Washington. In early October 2025, the corridors of the White House, Commerce Department, and Pentagon buzzed with disbelief. Japan, America's oldest ally in Asia, a cornerstone of its defense and economic system, had just publicly rejected the terms of a deal that Trump had called the greatest trade agreement ever signed. The president's economic advisor reportedly muttered during a briefing, "If Tokyo can walk away, anyone can." That sentence summed up the mood. Because Japan wasn't some emerging economy trying to hedge between Washington and Beijing, it was supposed to be the dependable one, the model of compliance within the US-led trade order. The problem wasn't only Japan's defiance, it was what came next. The South Koreans, the Taiwanese, even the Australians began questioning their own financial commitments. Washington had spent years building economic security partnerships to counter China. Now, those very frameworks were crumbling from within. Wall Street's wake-up call. When Tokyo's withdrawal became public, markets immediately turned on the Trump trade strategy. U.S. defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman, dropped more than 6% in 2 days. Energy giants tied to the Alaska LNG terminal project saw their shares fall amid doubts Japan would fund construction. The Dow Jones slid 580 points, while the yen briefly spiked as investors bet on Japan's newfound fiscal control. The Financial Times headline the next morning was blunt: Tokyo turns off the tap. Washington's allies rebel against the dealmaker. The policy meltdown. Inside the administration, the U.S. Investment Accelerator, the federal office created to channel foreign capital into strategic industries, suddenly found itself with no capital to channel. Dozens of pre-approved projects in Texas, Louisiana, and the Midwest were left in limbo. Shipyards in Alabama and semiconductor plants in Ohio that were supposed to receive billions from Japanese investors were now staring at empty ledgers. Trump's team scrambled to salvage the narrative. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, the architect of the framework, told reporters, "Japan remains a close ally. These are just procedural clarifications." But nobody believed it. Behind closed doors, Treasury officials admitted that Tokyo had never transferred a cent. For the first time since the 1980s, Washington realized it could no longer assume automatic financial compliance from its allies. Political fallout at home. On Capitol Hill, even Republican senators, many aligned with Trump, began to express frustration. They had promised voters 700,000 new jobs tied to the Japan deal. Now, local officials in Texas, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were asking how those jobs vanished overnight. Democrats, meanwhile, pounced. Senator Elizabeth Warren called the collapse proof that tariff diplomacy is economic suicide. Cable news anchors replayed Trump's triumphant July announcement alongside footage of Takayachi's calm rejection, an image contrast so stark it became symbolic. Pride met precision, and precision won. America's credibility crisis. For decades, the United States maintained global influence not only through military might, but through trust, the belief that partnering with Washington meant stability. Now, that belief was eroding. The image of the United States as an economic anchor had shifted into something else entirely: a coercive creditor with political strings attached. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, warned that the fallout could redefine Washington's relationships across Asia. The perception is that the U.S. doesn't negotiate, it dictates. Japan's defiance proved that model no longer works. Even long-standing allies like Australia and the Philippines began quietly recalibrating, opening talks with India and ASEAN partners to diversify away from American dependency. The strategic backfire. The irony was bitter. The Trump administration had designed the biggest deal to showcase U.S. dominance, to remind Asia that it was still safer inside America's economic orbit than outside it. Instead, the deal became a case study in how overreach creates resistance. By insisting on a total control of Japan's funds, Washington had exposed the very weakness it was trying to conceal: that its global influence was now being enforced by leverage, not leadership. As one Asian diplomat told Reuters, "America still has power. What it's losing is consent." A crisis of assumptions. In the weeks that followed, Washington attempted to reopen dialogue. But Tokyo had moved on, coordinating with Seoul and New Delhi to design a regional capital pool for infrastructure projects, excluding U.S. oversight altogether. The symbolism was devastating. The Indo-Pacific Partnership, once America's proudest diplomatic success, was now functioning without America. And while no one in Washington would say it aloud, the pattern was clear. The harder the U.S. tried to command loyalty through pressure, the faster its alliances fragmented. The United States hadn't just lost a deal. It had lost the illusion that its allies still needed permission to say no. Every shift in global power produces clear winners and quiet casualties, and the collapse of Trump's biggest deal ever was no different. It was meant to crown the United States as the uncontested leader of Indo-Pacific trade. Instead, it exposed a new reality. America's leverage had limits, and Asia had learned to live without it. Japan, from silent ally to sovereign power. In the past, Japan was seen as Washington's most reliable partner, a country that followed the rules, paid its dues, and rarely raised its voice. But in 2025, that image shattered. When Prime Minister Sanae Takayachi walked onto live television and announced that Japan would no longer send a single dollar to Washington without control over how it was spent, she didn't just reject a deal, she redefined Japan's identity. Overnight, her approval ratings soared. The Nikkei stabilized, the yen strengthened, and Japan's people felt something they hadn't in years: pride. What was once seen as submission to America's economic agenda now felt like independence reclaimed. In corporate Tokyo, business leaders quietly applauded her defiance. CEOs who had long complained about American interference saw her decision as a turning point, a reminder that Japan could trade on its own terms, not as a junior partner, but as a power in its own right. For the first time in decades, Tokyo wasn't reacting to Washington's policy. It was setting its own. Asia's quiet awakening. The ripple spread fast. Within days, South Korea questioned its own $350 billion commitment under a similar U.S. framework. Officials in Singapore, India, and Vietnam began exploring what they called regional capital cooperation, a softer way of saying Asian money for Asian projects. For years, the region's economies had been divided by competition and ideology. But after Japan's move, they began finding common ground, a desire for self-determination. It wasn't an anti-American movement, it was something more sophisticated, a post-American alignment, where countries could remain friendly with Washington but refuse to be financially controlled by it. By the end of 2025, early talks were already underway for a joint development mechanism, a new regional investment pool that would fund infrastructure across Asia without U.S. or Chinese oversight. What Washington saw as defiance, Asia saw as maturity. The United States, from enforcer to outsider. For Washington, the fallout was profound. Trump's administration had built its foreign economic policy on the belief that tariffs and pressure would force allies to comply. For a time, it worked. But Japan's defiance proved that coercion has an expiration date. The United States still had power, but what it lost was consent. The symbolism was brutal. A country that had once written the rules for the Pacific now found itself outside the room where those rules were being rewritten. Domestically, the political damage was immediate. The $550 billion investment that Trump had promised to bring home never arrived. The 700,000 jobs that were supposed to follow turned to smoke. Farmers, factory workers, and energy executives who had been promised a revival began asking what went wrong. For Trump, this wasn't just a foreign policy failure, it was a blow to his political brand. What had been billed as proof of America first became a reminder that America alone doesn't work. Corporate America's price tag. While politicians traded blame, American companies paid the real cost. Defense contractors lost billions in expected orders. Energy giants like Chevron and ExxonMobil, which had already budgeted for Japanese capital to expand LNG facilities in Alaska and Texas, were left stranded. Semiconductor manufacturers in the Midwest froze hiring and delayed expansion. One manufacturing executive told Reuters, "We needed a partner, not a power struggle." That sentence captured the essence of what went wrong. The U.S. had tried to use political muscle to secure business results, and in doing so, it scared off its investors, not its enemies. China's silent victory. While Washington scrambled, Beijing didn't need to say a word. It simply watched the U.S. undercut its own credibility. Chinese state media framed Japan's move as a return to dignity and quietly emphasized that Asia was moving toward a multipolar era of fairness. Beijing didn't have to pressure Japan. Washington did that for them. In the great game of global influence, sometimes winning means doing nothing at all. Europe, the opportunist. Across the Atlantic, Europe saw an opening. Brussels and Berlin began courting Tokyo and Seoul, positioning the EU as a balanced alternative to US and Chinese extremes. By late 2025, European trade envoys were quietly drafting new agreements with Japan's Ministry of Economy, deals based on mutual oversight and transparency, precisely what Trump's framework had lacked. The message from Europe was subtle but sharp. Partnership means equality, not obedience. It was a slogan tailor-made for a post-American world. The real winners. When the dust settled, one truth stood out. The winners weren't the loudest nations or the biggest economies. They were the ones that learned to say no without burning bridges. Japan didn't abandon America. It simply stopped outsourcing its sovereignty. Asia didn't reject the West. It just started trusting itself. And the United States, for the first time in a generation, was forced to confront the limits of its own influence, not because its enemies rose, but because its allies grew up. The world hadn't turned against America. It had simply stopped waiting for its permission. The collapse of Trump's biggest deal ever didn't just end a single agreement. It cracked open an entire chapter of uncertainty. For the first time in decades, America's closest allies are rewriting their own playbooks. The world isn't asking who leads anymore, it's asking who decides for themselves. What comes next depends on how Washington, Tokyo, and the rest of Asia choose to move through this new, uncharted landscape. Scenario 1. The balanced pivot. A new model of dual engagement. In the best-case scenario, Japan turns its defiance into diplomacy. Tokyo could position itself as the stabilizer between Washington and Beijing, anchoring an Asia that trades with both sides without being trapped by either. This would mean deeper cooperation with the United States on defense, but growing coordination with Asia and Europe on trade. Under this balance, Japan might lead a bloc of countries: South Korea, India, Singapore, Vietnam, seeking a third path between the two superpowers. It's not a rebellion, it's realignment. A world where power isn't concentrated in Washington or Beijing, but distributed among nations confident enough to chart their own course. For the U.S., this could still be a win, if it accepts that partnership now means negotiation, not command. Scenario 2. The backlash. Washington pushes back hard, but Washington may not take the lesson quietly. Inside the Beltway, talk is already circulating about reasserting control through new tariffs, sanctions, and trade conditions. If Trump or his successors choose confrontation over compromise, Japan's defiance could become the start of an economic Cold War inside the alliance itself. In this version of the future, the U.S. doubles down, tightening export rules, delaying defense cooperation, and pressuring allies who refuse to contribute capital on American terms. That approach might feel powerful in the short term, but it risks driving South Korea, India, and even Australia further into neutrality, or even closer to each other, forming an Asian bloc that no longer relies on U.S. funding or military protection. The result would be the opposite of what Washington wants: a Pacific region that looks unified from the outside, but functions independently underneath. Scenario 3. The quiet rebuild. A new understanding with Japan. There's another, quieter possibility: that both sides step back from the edge and rebuild. The United States might come to accept that Japan's independence doesn't threaten its influence. It protects it. Behind the scenes, joint working groups could reframe the deal into co-managed investment platforms, giving Tokyo equal voting rights and control over how funds are spent. This approach could repair trust and restore balance, transforming humiliation into partnership. It would take humility, something Washington rarely shows, but it's the only way to salvage credibility in Asia. If that happens, the next generation of trade agreements won't be about dominance but co-authorship. The US could still lead. Das Armbamas Dede just not alone. Scenario 4. The Asian Century, a self-funded future. The most transformative scenario is already beginning. Across Asia, finance ministers and development banks are exploring a new kind of cooperation: regional self-financing. Japan, South Korea, and Singapore are coordinating talks for what's being called the Asian Capital Partnership, ACP, a $1 trillion pool to fund ports, digital infrastructure, and green energy projects across the Indo-Pacific. The difference: no superpower oversight, no political conditions, no 45-day consultation windows. If the ACP succeeds, it would mark the beginning of what historians may later call the Asian Century, a global economy not defined by the US-China rivalry, but by the quiet confidence of nations that learn to build their own systems. And ironically, it wouldn't have happened without the failure of Trump's deal. Scenario 5. The Isolation Spiral. America's self-inflicted decline. The darkest outcome would be for the US to ignore the warning entirely. If Washington insists on using tariffs and threats as its only language, allies may stop answering the call. In that case, Europe continues building bridges with Asia, China fills the economic vacuum, and the US, once the architect of global trade, becomes its most unpredictable player. Economically, the world would adapt. Politically, the damage would last for decades. It wouldn't be a collapse of empire, just a slow, quiet irrelevance. The crossroads of power. These aren't just scenarios, they're choices. America can cling to dominance or evolve toward cooperation. Asia can isolate itself or embrace balance. And Japan, the catalyst of this shift, now stands in the middle, no longer the follower, not yet the superpower, but perhaps the blueprint for what independence looks like in the 21st century. In the end, what happens next won't be determined by who shouts the loudest, but by who learns the fastest. Because in a world this connected, the nations that adapt together will lead together, and the ones that try to rule alone will be left behind. The story that began as Trump's self-proclaimed biggest deal ever ends not with celebration, but with reflection. What was meant to showcase America's strength became a moment that exposed how fragile that strength can be when it depends on pressure instead of partnership. Japan's quiet refusal wasn't just a policy disagreement, it was a mirror held up to the world. It showed that alliances built on fear fade faster than alliances built on respect. It proved that economic sovereignty, once considered a luxury, has now become the currency of survival in a fractured global order, a changing world order. For decades, the United States defined what leadership meant. It wrote the trade rules, enforced them, and expected others to comply. That world no longer exists. Today, nations are realizing that dependence, even on allies, carries its own risks. And so, they are learning to diversify, to balance, to think beyond the shadow of one power or another. This isn't anti-American, it's post-American. A world not rejecting the United States but simply refusing to orbit around it. When Japan said no, it wasn't breaking an alliance, it was redefining it. It was saying that friendship can't mean submission, and cooperation cannot be one-sided. That message resonated far beyond Tokyo. It landed in Seoul, in Singapore, in New Delhi, in Berlin, in every capital that has quietly wondered what price comes with saying yes to Washington. America's choice. The United States now faces a choice it has avoided for years. It can double down on economic coercion, believing power alone will preserve its influence. Or it can adapt, accepting that leadership in this new century will mean sharing control, not demanding it. If it chooses the latter, it might yet rebuild trust and reimagine its role as a partner in an interconnected world. But if it clings to the old model of deals dictated from Washington and sealed with pressure, It will find itself surrounded by allies who no longer answer the phone when it rings. Because in the modern world, trust travels faster than trade, and once it's lost, no tariff can buy it back. The larger lesson. The fall of Trump's Japan deal will be remembered as more than a failed negotiation. It will mark the moment when Asia found its voice, and when the world realized that even the strongest empire can stumble when it stops listening. It's not a story about decline. It's a story about evolution. About a planet where power is no longer measured by who commands, but by who cooperates. And in that new order, Japan's defiance may be remembered not as rebellion, but as the spark that forced the United States to choose what kind of leader it wants to be. Because in the end, leadership isn't about making others follow. It's about earning the right to walk beside them.